Thank you very much indeed for that very generous introduction. And also thanks very much for the invitation to be here. It's really a great pleasure. I'm sort of a little bit of an emissary from RLDM. RLDM was actually in this very building about just 12 years ago, so it's really an incredible pleasure to come back. It's also been extremely nice to have a minute-by-minute account of how Rich Sutton's day when he found out he got the Turing Award. Talking of Rich, this looks a little bit like Rich in maybe like 50 or 60 years' time. This is actually Raman Kahal, who's a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist in the early part of the last century. So I show this as a sort of warning to you for my talk, really. So this is a book called Advice for a Young Investigator, which is something I recommend to my students. A little bit anachronistic, but he has this fantastic chapter called Diseases of the Will, which is all the ways you can fail in science. Well, many of them. And he has these lovely pen portraits of personality types destined for catastrophe. So contemplators, bibliophiles, and polyglots. They know many languages, some of them even useless. Obviously not in Canada, because you need to have many languages here. Megalomaniacs, of who I'm sure there are none in your departments. Instrument addicts, misfits. And his last category is theorists. Now, of course, I'm a theorist as far as neuroscience is concerned, but I'm sure there are real theorists here as well. Just to give you an example of how this has been so beautifully translated by the Swansons, about theorists, he said there are highly cultivated, wonderfully endowed minds whose wills suffer from a particular form of lethargy. Undeniable symptoms include a facility for exposition, a creative and restless imagination, an aversion to the lab, and an indomitable dislike for concrete science and seemingly unimportant data. When faced with a difficult problem, they feel an irresistible urge to formulate a theory rather than question nature. And he says, as might be expected, disappointments plague the theorist. So that's the role of a theory in at least in neuroscience. I'm sure not in reinforcement learning as a whole. Okay, so for the premise for this talk really is to talk a little bit about as I say, the marriage between natural RL and engineered RL. And this is a marriage which has really gone on for a very, very long time, since almost formally a little bit, since the middle of the last century. But earlier, in the very early part of the last century, there are many places where these disciplines met. And the reason is that both natural systems, in fact, not even only animals, even plants as well, are interested, and our engineered systems are interested in the same thing, predicting affectively important events, so events associated with reward and punishment, hopefully maximizing the former and minimizing the latter, unless you happen to be English, which is the other way around. And control in the light of those predictions, so designing control systems in order to do that maximization. So in a famous way to try and split up the puzzle of how to think about some of these questions comes from David Marr, who argued that we should think about computational, algorithmic, and implementational levels of analysis. So the computational level, you're asking questions about what are you trying to solve and what's the logic of the strategy. The algorithmic level is the effective procedures for doing that. And then implementation is the implementation itself. And Marr's point is that there's some separation between these different levels. And from a biological point of view, there's a very nice match between sort of the ethological questions about how animals are fit for the niches that they occupy. So how they go about optimizing their behavior and to survive and reproduce. And that matches the computational level. And then from the psychological perspective, so process models, process theories about how we go about how behavior is created, matches the algorithmic notion of effective procedures. And then, of course, implementation is then neuroscience. So ethology, they're concerned with optimality and the fitness of their behavior. And then, from a computational perspective, obviously in RL, we're interested in long-run reward optimization and aspects of estimation, so things like Bayesian estimation, for instance. At the psychological level, the learning rules from psychology are things like classical and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning is how animals are learning to predict things of importance in the future. And then there are actions which come automatically associated with those predictions. I'll show you some consequences of that later. Operant conditioning is more like regular RL, where you're saying I'm doing actions contingent on their consequences. So I do an action because I want to maximize reward or minimize punishment. And then, obviously, from an algorithmic point of view, in the computational side, we have learning rules like the delta rule or temporal difference learning, things like Monte Carlo tree search. So a number of effective procedures that then can link to what we can see in psychology. And then from an implementation side, you then have a number of so from a neural perspective, we know a lot about neural processes which are involved in aspects of reinforcement learning. And in RL is one of these areas where we can really go from top to bottom. We can really, we have excellent ideas from this community about the computational notions. What are we trying to optimize? And from the algorithmic point of view, how does that happen? And then those link very nicely to theories and also experiments in ethology and psychology. And this happens at many different ways. So I won't go through the whole history of this, but just to give you a few examples. In the very early part of the 1900s, there was a big battle between Thorndike and Tolman, effectively, between different brands of people who were interested in the control of animal behavior. So Thorndike was more a classical behaviorist, he had this thing called the law of effect, which really is that you tend to repeat actions which are followed by rewards. And so that we can think of that very much as a model-free RL terms. Whereas Tolman was very interested in cognitive maps. He had this idea about cognitive maps in men and animals. And so that's really, he was thinking in a very model-based way. But before the engineering side of things was understood well enough to understand what makes that difficult and what makes that easy. And so Tolman was a sort of also a bit of a prophet without honor in his time for those exact reasons. But there are many, you can trace many things. Actually, Rich's own sort of path through, Rich Sutton's own path through, from the early days towards temporal difference learning, went through many aspects of animal conditioning. So things like stimulus attention is what they call it in the conditioning world. We can now understand in terms of things like adaptive learning rates. I saw there was an IBDB poster the other day at this RL meeting as well. There's work on, so the work we think of for Dayan in terms of sort of offline processing, that's very nicely matched by, and I'll show you some data on this later, by ways of thinking about replay or pre-play in the hippocampus of animals during offline states when they're either grooming or eating or indeed sleeping as well. And the ideas have been around that they're then indeed involved in aspects of offline planning. Work on theory of mind, very nicely links to ways of thinking about multi-agent reinforcement learning as we think about what we know about the other agents that are there that are making choices too. And then aspects of things like working memory and long short-term memories. So many, many places where these fields really meet in a very fruitful and effective way, which I think has been one of the reasons why this area, certainly in decision-making, has really grown hugely over the last years. Okay, so how are we going to make progress for this talk is, so I thought there are many different things we could think about in terms of I guess the sound is not working. There are many different things we could think about in terms of trying to make sense of this. What I thought I'd do is, in terms of, at least in British marriages, what you're supposed to have is something old, for good luck, something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. So I thought I would style this talk and then talk about just a few different areas that colleagues and I have also been, and many other people as well, have also been involved in over the time. So for something old, I'm planning to talk about sort of temporal difference learning and dopamine, what we heard about at the beginning. So how those link up. That'll be very familiar, I think, to some of you. Something new, I want to talk a bit about liking versus wanting, which is a distinction which is, I think, not completely prevalent in this community, but is something that is present in neuroscience. And I think it relates to some of the questions we heard about alignment and about where rewards come from as well, and what actually is something which is wanted. Something borrowed, I'll talk about some work on risk-averse behavior, so some work on conditional value at risk that we and colleagues have done. And for something blue, a bit of a downer, I'll talk a bit about computational psychiatry, which is a field which is, again, grown out of thinking about how decision-making can go wrong using the ways that we hopefully understand something about how it can go right. In any marriage, certainly a long marriage like that, there may be some arguments. So I'll talk a bit about some of the places where where things don't match exactly. And then, of course, we need to say a little bit about the grandchildren or great-grandchildren by now, about where they are. So we'll hopefully get through that in this talk. Okay, so just to orient you in terms of some of the neural structures involved. So this is a picture of our favorite primate, the human brain. So this is the cerebellum that's involved in adaptive aspects of motor control. You have visual cortex, so visual processing happens here. This is the front, this is the back. This is the spinal cord. So critical players as far as reinforcement learning in the brain are concerned are the ventral tegmental area and the substantia nigra pars compacta. These are areas that have neurons which release dopamine on their targets. and we'll come across what dopamine does in a minute. And they project to the striatum, both the ventral striatum, which is sometimes called the nucleus accumbens, and the dorsal striatum. So these areas are involved in motor control, they're involved in affective processing, so in terms of evaluation as well. Then you have projections also to the prefrontal cortex. This area is involved seems to be involved in higher order aspects of things like, say, model-based reasoning as well. And then the amygdala, many of you may have heard of in terms of aversive processing. And then you see a more cartoon structure of this. So the striatum has this very complicated structure. It's very hard to get your mind around, where it has this tail. So it sort of winds around like this. So here you're now seeing from the front, and this is the striatum, which is now winding around, coming back to its tail, which is around the amygdala. So you can see it sort of has this winding around process like this to fit into the brain. Okay, so what we're going to look at is, in some of this, we're going to think about some aspects of how the VTA and the substantia nigra, these dopamine-releasing neurons, fire in the context of different tasks. So we don't have any sound, so you won't hear this. I was pleased to see this is like a beatboxing aspect of dopamine, but you'll have to listen to it yourselves on YouTube. So one of the starting points for thinking about this link between technical RL and neural RL comes from thinking about the role of the temporal difference prediction error in dopamine neurons. So I just want to show that to you, just to show you the sort of relationship that has been found. So, of course, you're all familiar with the TD error. Fortunately, this audience, I don't need to explain that itself. So Wolfram Schultz did an experiment where he was recording from dopamine neurons in monkeys, in this VTA and substantia nigra, those areas I showed you before, in the context of really three, just very, there was a sort of long history to this, but by the time he did this study, in just three simple conditions. So one condition is he gave the animal an unexpected reward. I showed it as cheese. It actually was just a drop of liquid in the animal's mouth. And so from a TD perspective, there's no prediction, there's no value. Therefore, what you see is a signal which should just look a little bit like some processing the reward itself. And so this is data from Wolfram Schultz. And so to orient you to how to understand this, what you're seeing here is a raster plot. So here, this is seconds, so 1 second, 2 seconds. And each of these lines is a single trial. So it's a case where he just gave the animal like an unexpected drop of juice in the mouth. And you can see that the dopamine neurons don't fire very fast. They fire about 1 to 5 hertz as baseline firing. And just shortly after, within maybe like a couple of hundred milliseconds, after giving this unexpected reward, you can see that you get just a few extra spikes on pretty much every trial. And so here you can create a histogram just by binning up the spikes in short temporal intervals. And you can see that you see a response which looks like something associated with the reward. So then what Schultz did was to train the animal that a cue, actually a fractal pattern on the screen, predicted a future reward. And then, as you will all know, you could expect to generate a prediction of value, which then rises with the cue and then falls as the reward is being delivered. And so the TD prediction error at this point only reflects where something unexpected is happening. So, of course, that happens only at the time of the cue and not at the time of the reward, which was expected after the end of training. And what you see in these dopamine neurons is, again, on these separate trials, you can see you just get 1 or 2 extra spikes, but they're beautifully timed with respect to the cue now, this light. And so that means you get this nice strong peak in the histogram at that time, indicating the animals have this prediction, just like this prediction error from this TD prediction error. And then he did the cruel thing of presenting the cue, but not giving the animal the reward. In that case, we expect a dip below baseline at the time of the reward should have been there. That dip should exactly mirror the positive rise at the time of the dopamine itself. And then what you see is something, again, on a trial-by-trial basis, which looks like this. You can see that there's just a short window where the spiking is absent on those trials. And you can see a number of other things here about the timing uncertainty and so forth that I won't go into. But this, in some sense, is the best evidence that the animals were making a prediction of that reward, because you can see that when the reward isn't there, you can see this nice dip below baseline there. So this was sort of data proving, or suggesting very strongly that these dopamine neurons respond to this TD prediction error. And that then was sort of the basis. This is what we did with Reed Montague and Terry Sinosky, basis for a lot of experiments. So this is not only true in the monkey brain, Yale, Neve, and John O'Doherty collaborated with them to look at what might this look like if we were to do it in humans, where we put humans into an MRI scanner so we can record essentially a blood flow signal itself. So what Yale did was a very simple task, like a task with free choices and forced choices. So the free choices is a choice between two bandit machines, labeled with these characters. Subjects would then make a choice here. Maybe they chose the red one. She then rendered it as like it's moving, and then it would generate a reward or no reward. And so the rewards that were available, and then there may be a forced choice trial, where the subject was forced to choose one of the bandits. And she had 4 different stimuli. So one bandit predicted a sure 40 cents, another one a sure 20 cents, another one predicted nothing, the yellow one, and then she had another one, the last one, the one which is actually interesting, is 50-50, 40 cents or 0 cents. So it's, on average it's 20 cents, and then, so sometimes you win, sometimes you don't. So very simple. So if you look at the TD prediction error, what you expect is after learning, or after you've accommodated that, you expect a nice strong signal to the 40 cent, a half signal to the 20 cent, a half signal to the uncertain one if there's no risk preference. And then at the time of the outcome, only in the uncertain one would you have a positive outcome if you got positive firing if you got 20 cents, and negative if you got nothing. So to understand what that would look like in the bold signal, so in the brain, in the signal that you could record in an MRI scanner, you're not recording activity, you're recording a signal associated with blood. And there's something called the hemodynamic response function, which is an empirically understood format, which says that if you have activity at this point, what's it going to look like in the MRI signal over time? So you can see you get this very long-lasting peak followed by a trough. In fact, there may be even a little dip at this point, very, very much at the beginning. So if you said, this is the signals I expect, what would I expect to see in the brain comes from convolving this hemodynamic response function with these signals. And what you expect to see then is the following in these 4 conditions. And because this is lasts so long, it actually outlasts a single trial. You actually get some other dynamics you can see. But broadly speaking, you can see for the sure 40 cent one, you get this nice big. You expect this nice big signal and then for the 50-50 signal, 50-50 Q. In the case you do get the reward, you expect it to be elevated. In the case you don't get the reward, you expect it to be a dip. And these small differences are to do with the statistics of the trials. Okay, so what Yale did was to mark the nucleus accumbens. So here, this is the target of the dopamine cells in the ventral tegmental area, and then just looked at the MRI signal you could see in the brain during this time. So she sort of worked out what the signal looks like, and so you can see that although these signals are not exactly the same, they are, and we could argue about exactly the differences. You can see that broadly speaking, there's a strong similarity between what we predict from a technical perspective about the TD signal and what you can see in the hemodynamic response function, where the 50-50, the red one, when you get the reward, you see this prolonged activity. When you don't get the reward, you see a dip below baseline. So that shows us again, because we can see this in fMRI, it means we can do a lot of experiments to understand, because it tells us something about the nature of prediction, because you see a signal here which relates to the prediction that subjects make, and prediction errors, which is how they're then changing those predictions. We can then go a lot further in understanding what might be happening. And indeed, even in this study, Yale looked at things like maybe there was a nonlinear utility function, which meant that as a function, different subjects had different risk sensitivities, and that might have been reflected in the way that the initial activity to this red stimulus, the one that is 50-50, 40 and 0 coming up itself. Okay, so because of this this set of results by many people, including ourselves, there's now an extraordinary wealth of these really computationally motivated studies. And so we can see aspects of SARSA, Q-learning, the actor-critic, aspects of stimulus attention. So many things have been like the whole of RLDM is filled with many aspects like this. And indeed, people have gone further and then asked a lot of richer questions then about and found many richer things. So lovely work from Mark Bellarmine and Will Dabney thinking about distributional RL and how that's reflected by particular nonlinearities in the dopamine neurons. Also Paul Massett, who's here, and Naoshita, Joe Patton, looking at temporal effects of this as well. So many interesting aspects of the signal can now be revealed because we have this tight link between the theoretical and the neural aspects of this. There's some interesting challenges that remain. So one, I think that, for instance, that a number of people have worried about, particularly Peter Schizzgal, actually all the time I've known him. If you think in things like drugs of addiction, or indeed if you directly can control the activity of dopamine neurons using optogenetics, where you can manipulate their activity, if you can control a prediction error directly, then if you say what should happen to the prediction, it should just keep on rising and rising and rising until it saturates. Because there's nothing, if you always have a positive prediction error, then always the prediction should be going up and up and up over time. And the evidence, actually in many aspects, many people for addiction and also for brain stimulation, where you actually cause directly the activity of dopamine neurons, is that actually doesn't happen. You don't get that saturating behavior from this activity. And so there's some really interesting sort of debates and trying to understand what might be going on there. There's some interesting new theory from Vijay Namadiri, who's thinking about sort of backwards aspects. So the TD obviously is working very much in a forwards direction, or thinking about forwards prediction errors. And there's this lovely work from Vijay, he's thinking now about aspects to do with how it goes backwards, and that's quite controversial in the field at the moment. And then there's also work on dopamine and other things that dopamine might be involved in. So not only about reward prediction error, this or reinforcement prediction error, but also how it relates to salience, how it relates to punishment, how it relates to aspects of model learning as well. And there are active debates about whether these are subsidiary effects of dopamine, or they're sort of core to the way that dopamine is working itself. So the story is not ended, even though we have a lot of data on this too. Okay, that's what I want to say about something old. So for something new, I want to talk about liking versus wanting. So, and this is very much associated with work from Kent Berridge, who's at Michigan. So if you think about yourselves, you can ask yourselves a question about, are there things that you like that you don't want? And so there are actually scales of liking scales. So there are things in the world that people can want, they have a need for, but they actually can express the fact they maybe don't like them when they actually get them, or vice versa. You see this in depression, you see this in drug addiction, where the late stages of drug addiction, people profess not to like the drug, but they very much want it in terms of needing to have it. What Kent has done was to look at some core affective reactions. If you put like a sweet drop of juice, a drop of sweet water onto the mouth of a baby, a monkey, or a human, or a rat, or a drop of a bitter or a sour drop onto the mouth. And you see a very characteristic orofacial reaction, right? So if something's sweet, they sort of ingest it, they want to like take it in. If you have something, you get these what they call aversive gapes. You put something bitter on your mouth, on the mouth, you'd like to reject it. And one thing that Kent had pointed out strongly is that this orofacial reaction is actually preserved under a dopaminergic blockade. So you block dopamine pharmacologically, so using drugs. You can show that or indeed other methods too, and you can show that this orofacial reaction, this liking or disliking reaction remains. And indeed it's boosted by opioid drugs in a way that the wanting aspect is not boosted by those drugs. So this is, I think, interesting from the perspective of what counts as a reward, right? We're putting something sweet on your mouth. Is that a reward by itself or not? And then the wanting aspect is controlling behavior. That's more like from Kent's perspective, from Berridge's perspective, the wanting is much more like the true reinforcement learning aspect of it. And then the liking, what is the liking doing for itself? So one set of experiments which I think bear on this concerns wanting and what's called flavor nutrient conditioning. So these sorts of experiments, what you do is you give an animal two equally liked flavors, equally preferred flavors of water, just water by itself. But then when you give one of the flavors, you pair that with the delivery of a nutrient to the stomach of the animal directly. So like you give it glucose or sucrose or something, or fat or something which has a direct value for the animal. And the other flavor, you just put a controls, just put water in or something else into the stomach. Then you come back on a later time and you offer the animal these either the two bottles, you offer one of the bottles, and you ask them what are they willing to ingest. And what you see, so this is cartoons from Ivan Duraujo. This is data from Scalfani, who basically invented this procedure. What you see is that in either a one-bottle test, you just give them one bottle and ask them how much they drink, or a two-bottle test, you ask them how much they prefer one flavor versus the other. You can see that they much prefer the flavor which was associated with the thing that had the nutrient into the stomach itself. And in fact, in this experiment, Scalfandi, they actually prevented the two flavors were both aversive directly. They were both sour. One was sour, one was bitter. And what he showed is that the liking responses, that orofacial or disliking responses, those aversive gapes, remained for these two items, even though the animal clearly was willing to ingest a lot of the item that had been associated with the reward. So what you're seeing here is a dissociation between a liking reaction or a disliking reaction and the true appetitive value in terms of controlling behavior. And indeed, we know from work from Ivan and Rui Costa and others that there are direct pathways from the stomach through the vagus nerve into the dopamine, ultimately through the nucleus solitary tract, into the dopamine system, which are reporting on what's been ingested by the animal. So your stomach provides a sort of true answer, essentially, to the value of something that you actually have. That then controls behavior, and there's an interesting pathway that happens. But the liking reaction could remain. So, we've seen this the classic plot of reinforcement learning, which is then often elaborated by saying, well, in fact, when we think about the true reinforcement learning perspective for an animal or a human, you can see that, in fact, all the external environment provides us with is things like stimuli, like water or food or whatever. And we have to evaluate those ourselves. We need an internal evaluation, some sort of internal critic, which is providing information about the value of those systems. It's just sensations and actions. So we're hardwired by evolution to provide us with information about that. And that hardwiring seems to be richer than you might have thought in terms of this distinction between the liking reaction and the stomach reaction. So, and we see this internal processing maybe in terms of things like pain, for instance. So pain is like a signal of an injury. So pain, there's an optionality to pain. So if you're in a very dramatic situation like a war, for instance, or in a battle, then you actually don't feel pain until such a point that you're in a more safe space. So it's state dependent. And then pain is organizing recuperative behavior. So what the internal system is having to do is to report something aversive here, but it reports it in a way which is adaptive for the way that the organism should process stimuli as a whole. And then for a reward, the same argument is there. Reward is a signal of benefit. It's also optional. It's state dependent. So if you're not thirsty, then the reward, of course, doesn't have a value. And it organizes, presumably, reacquisition of that substance. That's the reinforcement aspect of learning itself. And so why might you then have this separation between liking and wanting? Well, one notion, and you can see something like pain, if you actually had to wait until you were actually damaged, you put your hand on a hot plate, if you have to leave it there until there's actually physical damage to your fingers or in the context of pain, that would be a bad system. It would not be suitably adaptive in terms of prediction. So you need a warning signal as a preventative measure. And the same is true for reward. It takes a while for your stomach to process the food you've ingested to work out whether it's any good or not. And so waiting for gastric evaluation would make learning extremely difficult. You have to wait for a long time. And so what we have in this wanting and liking case, arguing, is that liking is like a revisable guess, like newspapers, like the first draft of history. So your taste system is like the first draft of the value of what you're going to receive. So you do this fantastic piece of chemical processing in the tongue and in the nose to try and work out, is this any good or bad? But in the end, the final arbiter is the stomach, which actually decomposes it and works out its different contents. So liking is like this revisable guess. And one way of thinking about that is that it's a bit like a potential-based shaping, a bit like this work from Andrew Ng and Stuart Russell, where you have a clue as to what the value might be like. But you're not going to commit to that until what the stomach actually says. So we now have this liking system and wanting system, which are both providing evaluation. Okay, so to sum up on this, why should liking and wanting dissociate? Right, we've seen some of these dissociations, and of course the true answer is they shouldn't really. In the end, you should like what you want and you should want what you like. But oral evaluation, the evaluation from the tongue, is too hard to work out what the value actually is going to be. So it's a good idea to have this separation process, so you can actually then allow yourself to have this evaluation. So liking is not as stupid as you might think, right? It's not only this chemical evaluation. There are actually substantial neural mechanisms associated with making liking work better. I don't know if any of you have had food aversion learning. So that's where you've ingested something and then you've gotten sick. And then typically, if there's something new that you ate at the time, then you'll be averse to that for a very long time, even last for up to years. That system seems to operate through the liking system, not through the wanting system. And we can see that by the orofacial reactions I mentioned. And then more generally, it gets at the neural structure of reward and punishment. So we think a lot about alignment. We think a lot about where rewards come from. And so the brain has these rich processes which generate reward signals, which I think then become very interesting to think about from our robot perspectives we heard about before. I should say that liking is a sort of fragile, what Berridge called fragile, in the sense that if you look at the neural systems involved in liking, they're much less robust than the ones involved in wanting. There's dopamine systems involved in wanting. And so there's some interesting issues about what that looks like from a neural perspective. Okay, so something borrowed. So can you see this? It's not very clear. Okay, so we gave. So we're interested in looking at risk aversion. Essentially, I think it's a very nice area in reinforcement learning, in theoretical reinforcement learning as a whole. So we gave our subjects. We were interested in risk aversion on sequential choices. So a lot of work on risk aversion has been on single choices, like a bandit. You just ask whether or not you're willing to take a 50-50, $10 versus $0 versus, you're willing to take that instead of having a sure $4, and people vary in their risk aversion. But once you make this happen in a sequential case, life gets more interesting and more complicated. So we gave about 30 of these mazes to subjects. So here, you're controlling this fridge robot, and your job is to try and get to the treasure chest here. And if you get to the treasure chest, you get a reward of +5. If you land in what Chris Gagne, who did this work, postdoc did this work, calls a lava pit, then you get caught. You get it's terminating RL, and then you get a punishment of -10. And the trick is, and you can see there are some walls here. I don't know if they're very clear. There are some walls in this domain you can't go through. And then the trick is that there's a 1/8 chance of an error. So you ask to go north, and then with 1/8 chance you go in some random direction instead. So that imposes some risk. So I think there are sort of 3 obvious paths. There's this path here, very shortest path. There's this medium path here, which looks like this, and there's a long path that goes around here. Okay, so hands up. Who would take the shortest path given this domain? Okay, wow, just a couple. Who would take the medium path? Sort of the majority. And who would take the longest path like this? And about the same. Interesting, very different from my lab. So very, very few risk seekers here, or even risk-neutral people here itself. So we ran this on about 100 subjects, and what we saw is that indeed, our subjects nicely did a bit like this domain, although not quite aligned. You'll see what the statistics are in a minute. Where some subjects indeed took this incredibly long path around. Here you can see an example of where they got pushed off course by our 1/8 randomness. Then you have, but there are subjects also who take this very short paths. So we were interested in characterizing what's going on. How can we think about the risk aversion associated with these subjects? So to do this, we use this modern risk measure, which we've actually seen at this meeting already. So we use this conditional value at risk. And just to align you on that, those who are not familiar with it, we can think about this in the St. Petersburg problem, or St. Petersburg paradox, which is one of the first places where risk sensitivity became surfaced itself in the community. So in the St. Petersburg paradox, or the St. Petersburg problem, the idea is we're going to toss a coin, and if it comes out tails, I'll pay you €2 or $2. If it comes out heads, we'll spin it again. If it then comes out tails, I'll pay you $4. And then if it comes out heads, then we spin it again, and we just keep on going and going and going. And the question is, how much are you willing to pay me to play this game? So, as many of you know, the expected value of this game is unbounded. So with half probability you get $2, with a quarter probability you get $4, with an eighth probability you get $8, and so forth. So the expected value is essentially unbounded. But if you ask people, if you think about yourselves, how much you're willing to pay me to play this game, most people say would be willing to pay me less than $10 to play this game, which is a huge discrepancy in terms of some sort of risk aversion essentially associated with this. So what CVAR does is to say, let's work out a lower quantile of the distribution of returns. So here, this is the full distribution of returns with probabilities. CVAR works out a lower quantile, so it has a parameter, the alpha parameter, which is the quantile you're looking at, which is in this case is here, this is say 7/8, so here. And then the CVAR, the conditional value at risk, is the average value in that lower quantile. So here it's it's basically whatever it is, just a bit over $4 or something in this case. And there's lovely work in the operations research community and the finance community thinking about CVAR as being a sensible risk measure. One thing you might note, for instance, as alpha tends to 0, you only care about the worst possible outcome there could be. And in a stochastic world, of course, the worst outcome is always the worst. The worst outcome, you always have some probability of getting the worst outcome. So life is extremely nasty. So there are two views of CVAR. There's this one here I've shown you where you're cutting down this distribution. So alpha is 1 is risk neutral. You go down to alpha is a half in this instance, and then all the values are exactly the same because of this very simple St. Petersburg paradox itself. The other one, and so it has a formal definition for what CVAR is like. The other way of thinking about it is sometimes called the distortion risk measure, because what you could do is you take the probabilities of each of these outcomes, and then you distort them, favoring the worst possible outcomes if you're risk averse. So there's a budget of distortion. So you're allowed to distort all the probabilities by something which the maximum value is 1 over alpha, where alpha is your risk, this risk level you're thinking about. And then, so you distort from the worst possible outcome upwards until you run out of probability mass. You still have to have a distorted distribution, which still adds up to 1, like any good distribution. So in this instance, if alpha is 7/8, then you can multiply all the worst things by 8 over 7 until you run out of oomph. And you run out of oomph here, and then that then is what defines the CVAR. So there are these two sort of dual views about how CVAR works. And in a sequential case, this gets much more interesting because if you think about the St. Petersburg paradox, you actually are flipping a coin, and then you're flipping another coin, you're flipping another coin, and you're flipping another coin, provided you keep on getting heads. And so you think, well, how is this probability distortion going to work in the context of CVAR? So the way it works is essentially something a bit like what you could think of as being like a justified gambler's fallacy. So the first time you flip, you actually have your 7/8 alpha. This is the alpha as being 7/8, for instance. And so here, the worst outcome is getting the tail. The best outcome is getting the head. So we have to distort. We have to boost the probability of getting the worst outcome, and we suppress the value of getting the second outcome. And so it turns out we multiply this one by 6 over 7, and that becomes the value. But the point is, in CVAR, we're committing, in this version of CVAR, we're committing to a total amount of risk along a path. So when you're thinking about doing the path in my fridge robot, you're committing to how much risk you're willing to incur on that whole path itself. Which means that if you were lucky early on, right, so here we were lucky we got ourselves ahead, it means we've already used up some of our good luck, right? We've already more risk, we've already taken some risk, we've been benefited from some of the risk process, which now means we better be a bit more risk averse in the future, because otherwise we're going to run into problems in terms of targeting our final risk along the way. And so it turns out that what you have to do now is to multiply your alpha value. So now you become more, in this instance, you become more risk averse to a tune which is actually the way you had to distort the probability that got you there. So you were lucky. That means that that luckiness was distorted. You have to sort of boost your risk aversion. So you have to decrease the value of alpha according to that. So now you have the new alpha value is 3/4. And so now you boost the chance of getting a tail by a lot more, and then the chance of getting a head by a lot less. You carry on doing this, and then it turns out then you run out of probability mass as a whole after three time steps, which is exactly what we expect in terms of how PCVAR works. So to make CVAR operate like this, you have to go through sequentially and keep on changing your risk preference as a function of what happens. And in the St. Petersburg paradox, all that can happen is either you're unlucky, you get a tail, or you've been lucky. And every time you're lucky, you have to be more risk averse in the future in order to calculate this CVAR value itself. And there's some nice work again in the RL community thinking about how to work this out in a sequential way. There's another version of CVAR, which also actually is also called a coherent risk measure. It's also a good quality risk measure, where you don't do this revaluation, but then you get it actually gives you a different measure as a whole. And this is, we sometimes call this like a nested evaluation process. And that again gives you a different value. In this case, it gives you an increased value. It's a less risk-averse value than the PCVAR value, because you're not committing along a whole path. So what we did is we took our subjects, these paths we had for our subjects, and we did a sort of inverse reinforcement learning, and fitted the value of alpha, the risk aversion that they had, and also whether they had this PCVAR or NCVAR, to the data to see what we could infer about them. So this subject, perhaps like a third of you, had this very low value of alpha, very risk averse, in order to make it worth going all this way around here to try and get to the outcome. And indeed, if we simulate from alpha is this low value of alpha that we saw in this subject, then you get paths which look, on average, a bit like the path that you see, almost by design. Then this subject we inferred a higher value of alpha, and the reason why we can infer a different value is because what happened as a result of the fact that things had changed in this case, that the subject that went back to go along this path convinced the system that the alpha value was much lower. The subjects who did this more medium path, they have a higher value of alpha, so they're more like the bottom 50% of the average value in the bottom 50% of the distribution. And then the guys who went, the very few of you who were risk neutral in this case, the value of alpha was equal to 1. And if we looked across our subjects, so here we have these, I just lined these 100 subjects, looking at the posterior value of alpha that we inferred. You can see that there are maybe like 10, 15% of the subjects had an alpha value of 1. Probably some of these actually were risk-seeking, but the way we designed the maze, we couldn't have seen this risk-seeking behavior, although you could, of course, fit that also with CVAR. Then you see this nice spread of values of alpha across these subjects. So it seems like this is really an interesting individual difference. And if you think about people in your lab or people you know in your life, I think we have this idea that there are people who are more risk-averse and people who are more risk-seeking. We saw it in your responses. And that probably generalizes outside just our simple maze domain. And then we did a check just to make sure we gave 30 of these mazes. We looked at the first half and the second half and showed that they had, when we inferred the value of alpha, they were very strongly correlated with each other. So we think that we are characterizing something meaningful about the alpha values that they have. Okay, so for this, I think in the interest of time, I will not talk about replay. You can come back and ask me about that later. We also looked at how you might do risk-averse planning, basically, and argued some aspects of how that looks like in mice. Okay, so something borrowed. We talked about risk sensitivity. So you can also look at risk seeking. So we can have values of alpha between 1 and 2 for risk seeking. We have an issue when we're fitting data, actually, about identifying alpha versus the probability of disaster. So basically, it acts a bit like the discount factor, like the regular discount factor in RL, like the gamma. You can think of that as being a probability of termination. And so if in a game like this, where termination is the end, then you can imagine that there's actually a confound almost in terms of the evaluation of that. And so we have that to worry about when we're doing fitting. Other risk measures also need to do something equivalent to this adjustment. They need another dimension to process as you go through. We thought about counterfactual planning for defense. Imagine you're an animal going into a new environment, you're having to forage. Maybe you want to think in advance of what you would do to protect yourself if a predator came from one side or a predator came from another side. And so you can imagine that we do some risk-sensitive planning ahead of time, and that's actually what we think of as one of the aspects of what replay does. So it's a sort of dyna, if you think of it in dyna terms, but now you're planning counterfactually for the disasters that might happen in the future. And then we also thought a bit about risk-sensitive exploration as well. And then it relates actually a bit to computational psychiatry too. Okay, so for psychiatry, the argument is that sometimes we're thinking about pathologies of any sufficiently complicated system which is operating in a noisy, changing, partially known environment, social environment, which is replete with dangers. That's our fate as a human animal, right? Of course, we've organized the world to try and avoid some of the consequences of that, at least those of you who live north of the border. But there are obviously, these are problems which lead to consequences for the way the decisions get made. So in psychiatry, of course, a lot of the work has to do with, a lot of the issues that patients report have to do with feelings or emotions. And indeed, it's interesting, there are some really important ways of thinking about that in an oral perspective, but I'm not going to talk about those now. Because also, we live in worlds where there are decisions which are considered suboptimal, either by individuals themselves perhaps when they're in other states of mind. So you can think of this as Ulysses on the mast, right? So he's listening to the sirens. So he knows that if he were able to act on what the sirens did, in that state, he would like to do something catastrophic to himself. So what he does is he binds himself to the mast to prevent that from happening. So here's an example of somebody, this is not a psychiatric case, but it's an example who says understands that in different states there are different things that we want. And so this state dependence of changes is going to have a big effect as well. And, or other people, in other cases, there people do things that other people wish they wouldn't do. And so here you might think of Hannibal. So he was quite happy to do the awful things that he did in this movie, but other people were a little bit less happy. So that's what's happening. So people are making decisions, they're making choices, they're doing actions which have this negative constructs themselves. So there are a number of ways in computational psychiatry that we can think of how decision-making can go wrong. If you think about, of course, our decision-making goes wrong in RL terms, you can think about, well, what makes systems go wrong that you build yourselves? So one way of splitting up the pie that I'm fond of is the following. You can imagine that the flesh was willing, but the spirit is weak. So you can think of this being your system is trying to solve the wrong problem. So anhedonia, some things that used to be appetitive to you, used to have reward value, they lose their reward value. Then even if you're doing the optimal behavior, you're going to end up doing things which you're no longer going to explore or going to try to engage with the world because you don't think you value those things that would happen in the future. You could have the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. The solutions that you come up with in terms of controlling behavior are incompetent, but you're still trying to do the right thing. We think of that as being the wrong solution. You can have, the flesh could be weak and the spirit could be weak. That was in our case was Brexit, or in your case it's other things. There. But I think actually a very important case instead is where the flesh is willing and the spirit is willing too, but they've been adapted to an environment which is a unfortunate environment. So here you think of you adapt that to a desert environment with no benefit possible. If you then move into an environment like a rich rainforest where there are many advantages, many possibilities as well. If you've set the way that you think that it's a good idea, for instance, to explore in the world, if you believe that you've set those bits in a context of a desert, then there's simply no point in trying to explore, to engage. And so therefore you won't find out that the world has changed itself. So there are a number of cases that we can then use in computational psychiatry to look at that. I was going to talk about a theory of mind case, but I think I will not do that in the interest of time because I want to get on a couple of other things too. So just to say a word about this. So thinking about computational psychiatry, many different conditions in psychiatry have a flavor of decision-making that has gone wrong in various different ways. So you can see this in ADHD. People have thought about discounting as going wrong in ADHD. In aspects of depression, so anhedonia, so things you value, you no longer value. There's work on controllability or empowerment, something else we've seen at this meeting as well, where if you believe that you don't have control over the world, then you don't have an incentive to try and explore and find out, in fact, you may indeed have control over the world. In OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, people are interested in issues of how you'll become certain about the environment that you have, about the beliefs you have. So you want to keep on collecting more information. That can lead to some aspects that look a bit like obsessions and compulsions as well. And then in anxiety or PTSD, you can think about risk sensitivity, like I showed you before, where if you're worried about very severe risks, then of course that will change your behavior in dramatic ways. And then there are also, in theory of mind, which I didn't get a chance to talk about, you think about modeling other people in a cognitive hierarchy. And then I should say that, come back to the issue about systems operating in a complicated environment. So we did some work with Eric Schultz thinking about computational psychiatry for computers. So how is it that your computer systems can also go wrong? They can also have this path dependence, which leads to problems and biases as well, that I think we're very familiar with and maybe you've talked a bit about even in this meeting. Okay, so where's the arguments? So there are many places where these systems don't quite match. I think one it's nice to think about is architectural inductive biases that we have. So here's one of my favorite experiments by Hirschberger called Chicken in a Looking Glass World. So this is a chicken, according to Google, and this is a chicken feeder, which looks like a beheaded civil servant. And what Hirschberger organized was an organization where if the chicken ran towards the feeder ran away at twice the speed. But if the chicken ran away from the feeder, then the feeder ran towards him at twice the speed. So the way that this hapless chicken should get fed is by running as fast as he can away from what he thinks of as being his source of food. So needless to say, the chickens couldn't learn that. But if you think about it from a reinforcement learning perspective, why not, right? It's just you're moving in some arbitrary direction with respect to something which can give you food. Why on earth would you not be able to do that? And the answer is this is a strong inductive bias that relates to classical conditioning we talked about. And one way to think about this is this thing called the affective circumplex, or like an axis which is very common in the emotion world, actually, where you have an axis which runs, one axis that runs from punishment to reward, an affect axis. Then you have an effect axis which runs from inhibition to invigoration. And so this is what you actually do. And it turns out for interesting, probably evolutionary reasons, that there's a coupling between the invigoration axis and the reward axis, which means that if you predict something which is associated with positive reward, then you have a tendency to engage and approach and engage with that thing. And in the Hirschberger circumstance, this pre-programmed policy, which means you engage and move in the direction of the item, means that you're actually going to harm yourself in terms of getting the food you can't actually get itself. So these things are coupled together in a way which then makes life complicated. You might think that only happens to chickens. In fact, it happens to humans too. So we did a study on humans where we gave them exactly this circumstance, and though just to very briefly say, so we gave a number, each of these, so we gave humans the context where they gave them a cue that said essentially if you press a button, you will not get a reward. If you don't press a button, you will get a reward. And what you can see here is that each line is one of our subjects. Each gray dot is a case where they did not press the button. So you can see there are some subjects here, and the overall average is shown by this black wiggly line. So there are some subjects who in 60 trials, they pressed the button on every single trial, even though they never got a reward. So there's a good sort of Protestant work ethic. They think they're going to have to work for me, press a button to get their reward. In fact, they're not going to get a reward for doing that. And a third of the subjects, they would press the button every single time. So we're just as susceptible as chickens in this context. Okay, and there are a number of other areas where I think that there's not an exact match between them. So this inductive biases, we need to think about different inductive biases for us versus them. Obviously, things like attentional capacity, our ability, our working memory capacity or our attentional capacity is completely radically different from what you can choose to program on your robots. The way we can do replay, like DQN, you can have this huge memory buffers of actual events that happened. We can't afford to do that. So we have to have replay in a different way. And also the learning algorithms themselves will be different. Sorry, 2 more slides. So what's the progeny, the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren of this? So where are the areas where I think there's a lot of work on both communities working on? So representational learning, a lot of work you can see in this meeting, and also in our field was thinking about that too. Thinking about internal action, so attention, how we pay attention to things and sort of internal actions that we do inside the head to control the mechanisms of planning, the mechanisms of search that we do ourselves. Sophisticated model-based decision-making. There's ever more evidence in animals about model-based. We ask the questions better. We can see that animals are doing better and better at building sophisticated models of the world and planning with those too. Hierarchical control, something very important, intuitively important, very hard to formalize, as you can see in the context of this meeting too. Metacognition, meta-control. How do we understand the certainty of our choices, the certainty of our plans, and how do we exert control in the light of those as well? And also what I mentioned, these sort of path-dependent pathologies that we could see in the context of psychiatry. And then, obviously, we live in a world where we do this continual learning, and so we do multitask learning. We operate in these open worlds, and so I think some of the things that you guys are thinking about, I think, would be very valuable for us to think about those too, and of course also continuous control for the roboticists amongst us. And there are very interesting issues about we are fantastically robust systems, evolution, sort of society level, and both individuals, society, and over the course of evolution. And I think our systems are not nearly as robust in those cases. Okay, before I finish, I would really acknowledge a large number of people who I've worked with over the years. So particularly mention, obviously, people in this community like Rich and Andy, learned from them hugely over the time. Also, people I've worked with like Reed Montague, Terry Sinofsky, and a large range of students and postdocs over this time. Done a lot of work with them too. Okay, just to sum up. So we've had this long and happy marriage. The marriage, we have common computations, common algorithms, and a very different, even though we have different implementations, I think this marriage has been very good. Of course, it's been a slightly open marriage. So we've had dalliances with neuroscientists and you guys have had dalliances with broader machine learning, but nevertheless, we've managed to stick together despite this. And of course, there are many temptations in the future that will try to split us apart too. So there you go. Thank you very much.